The vending machine hummed its lonely electric song at 0135 hours, fluorescent light casting shadows that made the break room look like a tomb. Brooke Sullivan sat on the plastic chair, the one nearest the humming refrigerator, farthest from the door, unwrapping a sandwich she'd made 6 hours ago. The bread had gone hard. She didn't care. 3 other nurses had entered the break room at 0127, seen her sitting there, exchanged a glance, and left without pouring their coffee. This was routine now. 14 days of it. 14 days since she'd questioned the billing codes in front of a patient's family, and Dr. Sterling had responded by moving through the hospital like a man laying traps. She bit into the sandwich. Chewed methodically. Her hands were steady, the hands of someone who'd held a tourniquet on a femoral artery while running through hostile fire, held them steady while a fellow operator's blood soaked her forearms in a combat outpost 2,000 miles from here. Those hands didn't shake over a stale sandwich and professional isolation. Sacred Heart's night shift was a different kind of battlefield. No bullets. No IEDs. Just the fluorescent hum of overhead lights and the slow, calculated destruction that came from a man with institutional power and a grudge. Dr. Sterling had started small, a charting error he claimed she'd made on a patient's intake form. Brooke knew she hadn't made it. She knew because she'd checked the electronic medical record 3 times, each time finding her documentation pristine, each time finding that his notation had appeared overnight in the system, backdated with surgical precision. He was good at this. Methodical. Patient. Like a scout preparing the ground for an ambush. The next incident came 4 days later. A medication discrepancy on the narcotics log, a morphine count that didn't balance, a gap of 5 milliliters that Brooke knew hadn't come from her hands. But the timestamp on the pharmacy report showed her initials. The initials were perfect. She recognized her own handwriting in the digital signature, but she hadn't signed it. She never touched that log on Tuesdays. She worked Monday, Wednesday, Friday nights, and the occasional Saturday. Sterling knew her schedule. Everyone knew her schedule. Which meant he'd known exactly when the system would show her as responsible for the discrepancy. Brooke set down the sandwich and pulled the personnel file from her scrub pocket, a printed copy she'd obtained from Human Resources, each page bearing the marks of Sterling's careful documentation. The first write-up, dated 3 weeks ago. Charting errors, the summary read. Failure to maintain attention to detail. Her signature at the bottom, obtained during a shift when she'd signed a stack of routine medical authorizations without reading them. She'd recognized nothing unusual in the moment. By the time she understood what had happened, the document was already in her file, already part of the narrative Sterling was constructing. The sandwich sat untouched now. She folded the papers and returned them to her pocket, her jaw tight but her breathing steady. This was stage 3. Strategic moves. He'd moved past the public condescension that had come in week 1, when he'd told her in front of 3 residents that she should stick to bedpans and leave medicine to physicians. She'd held his eyes for 3 seconds without flinching. He'd walked away first. That had made him angrier. So he'd escalated to documentation. To the weaponization of systems and bureaucracy. To the construction of a paper trail that would eventually support whatever action he decided to take next. She'd seen this before. Not in hospitals. In operations in the Helmand province where an officer would move against a soldier he decided was a threat, constructing the narrative brick by brick, building the case methodically, removing witnesses or allies before making the final move. Sterling was following the same playbook. Just in a different uniform. Brooke stood and disposed of the sandwich in the trash. She didn't eat it. Her metabolism hadn't shifted in 12 years, she could run 48 hours on minimal calories if the tactical situation required it. The break room felt smaller as she walked back toward the unit. The fluorescent light seemed to hum at a different frequency, like a warning system preparing for something. Sacred Heart's trauma bay sprawled across the eastern wing of the hospital, a fortress of technology and white coats and the controlled chaos of people working to prevent death from winning. Brooke had been walking into this space for 5 years, ever since she'd taken the night shift nursing position under an assumed name from a government that had officially erased her service record. 5 years of careful mediocrity. 5 years of being the quiet one. The one who worked extra shifts and never complained and never drew attention. The one who could have advanced to charge nurse 3 times over but had declined every promotion, every offer to train new staff. The quiet one who everyone assumed was just a competent but uninspired healthcare worker who'd settled for the night shift because she couldn't handle the pressure of the day units. Bed 12 held Private First Class Marcus Chen, 23 years old, admitted 6 days ago with crush injuries and blast trauma from an IED in Sanjin Valley. The left side of his face was wrapped in medical gauze. Both his legs were immobilized in suspension equipment, the bones underneath shattered and reassembling themselves with the help of modern medicine and time. His eyes were the part that worried Brooke the most. They had the flat, empty quality of someone whose neurological wiring had been partially severed. Blast-induced amnesia. He didn't remember his unit. Didn't remember his mother's name. Didn't remember why he had her call sign tattooed on his forearm in block letters, Sullivan. She checked his vitals with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 5,000 times. Blood pressure 1/62. Heart rate 88. O2 saturation 96% on 2 liters nasal cannula. The monitor behind his bed displayed the steady green trace of a normal sinus rhythm, the electrical pattern of a heart that had survived what the rest of him almost hadn't. She adjusted the 4-line running into his subclavian vein, confirming the placement was secure, the flow rate precise. The line itself was a 20-gauge catheter, positioned for rapid infusion if his condition deteriorated. He'd been stable for 72 hours. No fever spikes. No signs of compartment syndrome. The surgical team had cleared him for passive physical therapy starting tomorrow. "How's the pain?" she asked, keeping her voice low and steady, the tone she used with all trauma patients, neutral, professional, designed to convey that she was someone who could be trusted with the truth. Chen's eyes tried to focus on her face. Failed. "It's, where am I? Sacred Heart. Savannah. You're safe. My arm." His gaze drifted down to his forearm, where her call sign caught the overhead light. Sullivan, written in her own handwriting, committed to his skin the way only combat operators did, permanent, indelible, a name burned into memory so deep that amnesia couldn't erase it. Except in his case, the amnesia had. He stared at the letters like he was reading a foreign language. "Why does that name mean something?" "You'll remember," Brooke said. It wasn't a medical assessment. It was a promise. The brain heals. Give it time. She moved to the next bed, a post-operative abdominal surgery patient, stable, vital solid, no cause for concern. But her awareness remained centered on the hallway behind her, on the moment Sterling had entered the unit an hour ago with his pristine white coat and his calculated smile. She'd felt his presence the way combat soldiers feel the presence of a sniper, not through sight or sound, but through the minute atmospheric change that comes when someone is directing focused intention at you. The nursing station occupied the central position of the trauma bay, a fortress of monitors and keyboards and the accumulated paperwork of modern healthcare. Brooke had been standing there for approximately 4 minutes, reviewing Chen's labs, when she noticed the billing file open on the secondary terminal. Not the usual electronic format. A printed stack of charge sheets for recent trauma activations, laid out in a way that suggested someone had wanted them visible. The bills were marked with a highlighter. Specific procedures highlighted in yellow. Chest tubes on patients without pneumothorax. Pericardiocentesis charges on patients who'd never undergone cardiac tamponade. Trauma activation fees billed for level 1 traumas that had downgraded to level 2 within minutes. The pattern was obvious once you knew what you were looking at. Inflated charges. Phantom procedures. Insurance fraud with the kind of careful documentation that would take weeks to untangle. Each charge justified by a note. Each note written in a hand she didn't recognize but in Sterling's authorized signature block. $17,000 in questionable billing across 6 patients admitted in the past month alone. More than enough to trigger an audit. More than enough to justify the involvement of federal investigators. Interesting, isn't it? The voice came from behind her, smooth as oil, careful as a chess player announcing checkmate. The way patterns emerge if you know where to look. Brooke didn't turn. She'd known he was coming. She'd felt the shift in air pressure that signaled his approach. But she maintained her composure, the mask she'd perfected over 5 years of civilian life, the performance of the unremarkable night shift nurse who worked quietly and didn't ask questions. She moved the billing file to the side of the desk with the same methodical care she'd use moving a landmine. These charges don't match the clinical documentation. Really? Sterling stepped into her line of sight, his expression the practiced concern of a physician responding to a staffing problem. That's concerning. You should probably bring that to the compliance department. Through proper channels, of course. Not through conversations with patients' families. Not through inappropriate questions directed at other physicians in the presence of medical staff. There it was. The real message beneath the words. The reminder that he knew about her conversation with the Ramirez family 3 weeks ago, when she'd questioned the chest tube charge on Mrs. Ramirez's bill and Sterling had responded by dressing her down in front of the patient, his voice dripping with condescension, his performance designed for an audience. The message was clear: I see what you're doing. I'm documenting that you're doing it. And I'm prepared to make sure that documentation becomes part of your permanent record. Brooke met his eyes. Held them for 3 seconds. Then turned back to the billing file without responding, a statement in itself, a refusal to grant his words the weight he was trying to assign them. She heard him exhale, a small sound of frustration that he tried to cover by clearing his throat. He'd been expecting her to challenge him, or defend herself, or ask questions. Her silence was something else entirely. It was the composure of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided it wasn't worth the energy to fight it yet. He walked away toward the resident stations, and Brooke allowed herself a single breath of the kind that comes after you've survived something dangerous, shallow, controlled, the kind that doesn't change the shape of your shoulders or the line of your jaw. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling was right. The billing patterns were sophisticated enough to require serious investigation. Which meant that bringing them to the compliance department would initiate a process that would eventually lead back to him, yes, but it would also lead directly to her. And Sterling had already spent 3 weeks constructing a narrative that positioned her as unreliable, potentially unstable, possibly fabricating concerns because of personal conflicts with hospital leadership. A narrative supported by his carefully forged charting errors and medication discrepancies. A narrative that would make her allegations look like a retaliation complaint rather than a legitimate concern. She closed the file and returned it to the cabinet where it didn't belong. The password to access it wasn't hers. She'd noticed it left open on this terminal, deliberately in her line of sight. A trap. A test. A way to see if she would take the bait and demonstrate the kind of boundary violations that would support the story he was already telling about her competence. Her shift continued through the darkness. 2 new trauma admissions, a motorcycle accident at 0347, a penetrating stab wound at 0519. Both patients made it through the night. She worked through the exhaustion with the efficiency of someone whose body had been trained to function on minimal sleep for extended operations. Somewhere around 0600, as the sky outside the trauma bay windows began to shift from absolute black to the grey of pre-dawn, she made her way to the staff locker room in the basement. The locker was number 47, 3rd row from the bottom. She spun the combination without thinking, the muscle memory of dozens of years, and opened the door to reveal her scrubs hanging on hooks, her personal items minimal and utilitarian. A phone charger. A hair tie. Deodorant. And on the bottom shelf, beneath a towel, the pair of worn combat boots. Size men's 8. Still dust-covered from the Sanjin Valley, though she'd never run them through water or done anything to erase the evidence of where they'd been. The laces were frayed. The leather was cracked along the sides where they'd expanded and contracted in desert heat. The soles were worn thin in places. She could see the original issue date on the inner tongue if she looked closely, 2011. 12 years. The boots had traveled through 2 decades worth of human time and 3 lifetimes worth of operational intensity. She'd worn them in places that didn't exist on any map she'd ever signed. She'd bled in them. She'd carried wounded brothers in them. She'd left parts of herself in them that she'd never fully retrieved. No one at Sacred Heart knew why she had them. No one asked. The night shift nurses didn't pry into each other's personal items or question the things people carried in their lockers. That was the unspoken agreement. You worked the dark hours, you kept your secrets, and in return, everyone left you alone. She closed the locker door and headed back upstairs, back to the units, back to the mask of the unremarkable nurse. But her hands, calloused and scarred and capable of things the civilians around her couldn't imagine, moved with the precision of muscle memory as she continued her rounds. It was 0743 when she clocked out, and the morning shift was beginning to arrive, fresh nurses in clean scrubs, ready to take over the chaos that had occupied the night. She was walking toward the exit when she passed Sterling in the hallway. He didn't acknowledge her. She didn't acknowledge him. They moved past each other like two ships navigating a narrow channel, each aware of the other's presence, each calculating angles and approaches. She didn't know that he'd already made the phone call to the board member who owed him favors. She didn't know that the narrative he was constructing was nearly complete. She didn't know that in exactly 11 days, she would be in a human resources office facing charges of performing medical procedures outside her scope of practice, her carefully maintained record of competence dissolving like watercolor in rain. What she did know was that Sterling had shown his hand. And once an enemy showed you his strategy, you could begin to predict his moves. Room 407 smelled like antiseptic and Mrs. Chen's jasmine perfume, that delicate floral note fighting a losing battle against bleach and decay. Brooke was checking the cardiac monitor leads when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his shadow falling across the bed like a blade. His timing was never accidental. "Miss Sullivan," he said, loud enough that nurses at the station could hear. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why you questioned a chest tube procedure in front of a patient's family." Brooke didn't turn from the monitor. Her hands continued their work, steady, methodical, untouchable. "The procedure code doesn't match the documentation in his chart, Doctor." Sterling stepped into the room fully. His shoes clicked against the tile floor with each step, a sound like a prosecutor approaching the witness stand. "Or is undermining physician judgment part of your nursing curriculum now?" His emphasis on a miss dripped like acid. He was establishing dominance for the audience. This wasn't about the chest tube. This was about making her small in front of Chen's elderly parents, who watched from the bedside chairs with the careful stillness of people trying to disappear. The billing code listed as 32210 requires a pneumothorax diagnosis, Brooke said quietly. Private Chen has neither. Sterling's laugh was theatrical, performed for the room. "Stick to bedpans and leave medicine to physicians, sweetheart. That's what you're trained for." He turned to face Chen's parents directly, his body language shifting to reassurance, a master class in manipulation. "I assure you, this nurse's concerns are unfounded. Your son received the best possible care." Chen's mother looked away from Brooke's eyes. It was pity, or worse than anger, worse than mockery. The kind of pity you give someone who doesn't understand their place. Brooke felt the weight of it settle on her chest like a sandbag. She took one measured breath through her nose. Sterling lingered for a moment, watching for a reaction. When Brooke didn't give him one, he left, his footsteps fading down the hallway. She completed the vital signs check. Her heart rate remained at baseline. Her breathing stayed even. But when she pulled off her gloves, one tear slid down her cheek, just one, silent and sudden. She wiped it away before anyone could see, and when she glanced at Chen's parents again, she met Mrs. Chen's eyes with devastating calm. "He'll be fine," Brooke said simply. "I'll check on him every 30 minutes." 2 days later, she learned what Sterling had been doing. The break room was its own kind of trauma bay, fluorescent lights humming like insects trapped in a cage. Brooke sat down at the corner table with her sad sandwich and a bottle of water. Within 15 seconds, every conversation died. Nurse Patterson grabbed her lunch mid-bite and stood up. Chen's night shift RN, the one who'd mentioned Sterling's behavior weeks ago, suddenly remembered she had charting to complete. One by one, the veteran nurses filed out, their message crystal clear. You are contaminated. Stay alone. The vending machine hummed beside her. Brooke ate her sandwich while it sang its mechanical lullaby, the hiss of cold air the only sound at her table. She didn't watch them leave. She didn't try to follow them or defend herself. She simply sat in the fluorescent glow and made herself smaller. On Friday, she arrived at 1900 hours for the night shift and found it. The write-up was posted on the unit board where everyone could see it, printed in Sterling's careful block letters, signed by administration and dated 3 days earlier. Sullivan, insubordination. Failure to follow chain of command. Medication discrepancy investigation pending. Below that, fabricated tardiness logs. She'd never been late in 14 years. Below that, charting errors she'd never made, date circled in red, his handwriting marked verified by nurses who'd never met her. She was reading it when night shift gathered around her, their silence worse than mockery. Sterling had been building this for 3 weeks, a paper trail so careful, so methodical, that it looked legitimate. A house of cards built on sand, but sand was enough when you had board connections and hospital lawyers who owed you favors. Brooke's hand trembled as she signed the acknowledgement form, not from fear but from something colder. Rage, maybe. Or clarity. She looked up from the clipboard and found Sterling watching her from his office doorway, 30 feet away. His expression was satisfied, the look of a man who'd made his first move and watched it land exactly where intended. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. You'll want to check your own documentation more carefully, Doctor, she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. Insurance auditors are usually thorough. His smile never wavered. But something flickered behind his eyes, a moment of uncertainty, quickly buried. He knew she was close to understanding his scheme. He knew what he'd done. And now he knew she knew. He stepped back into his office and closed the door. Brooke folded the write-up and placed it in her locker, beneath the pair of worn combat boots she'd kept for 12 years. The leather was scuffed and pale at the toe caps, creased from 1,000 miles of running. Her fingers traced the laces for a moment, and then she closed the locker door. She had a shift to work. She had patients who would need her, even if the hospital didn't believe she was worth anything. At 0157, everything changed. Brooke was checking Private Chen's vitals, heart rate steady at 76, oxygen saturation 98% on room air, the monitor displaying what looked like recovery when his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His pupils were dilated, blown wide from the morphine they'd given him 4 hours ago, and his eyes were searching her face like a man reading a map he half remembered. I know you, he whispered. Sanjin. Someone carried me 3 miles through. He swallowed hard, his throat working around words that wouldn't come. His heart rate spiked on the monitor. 75, 82, 89. Brooke gently removed his hand and placed it on the bed beside him. You need to rest, Private, she said in the low, steady voice she used for frightened patients. The medication is still in your system. You're confused. No, Chen said, but his eyes were already losing focus, drifting back into the dark water of chemically induced sleep. His monitor settled back to baseline. She waited 3 minutes to make sure, watching his breathing deepen, watching his hand relax on the blanket. Then she turned to leave. The trauma bay doors exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the entire unit. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. A man stood in the doorway, 6'5", 250 pounds of muscle that seemed barely contained by his soaking wet civilian clothes. His eyes were wild, searching, and his voice when he spoke came out raw and desperate. Where is he? Where's Marcus? They said he was dying. They said, his words slurred at the edges. He was swaying, one hand braced against the door frame to keep himself vertical. Security guard Davis froze behind the intake desk, his hand hovering over the phone. The unit secretary ducked behind her computer monitor like it might stop a bullet. Dr. Sterling backed toward his office with the smooth precision of a man who knew exactly where the exits were. 2 nurses sprinted for the medication room, their movement synchronized, practiced, the retreat of prey animals detecting a predator. Brooke moved toward him instead. Her hands came up slowly, visible at waist level, palms open. Empty. A posture she'd learned a long time ago, in a place and context that had been officially erased from every record. Her voice cut through the chaos like a knife through silk, low and steady and ringed with the kind of authority that comes from having talked down armed men in places where mistakes were fatal. "Sergeant Morrison," she said. Not a question. Not a request. A command made to sound like conversation. "Jake. Look at me." His eyes tried to focus on her face but couldn't seem to lock on. His massive frame swayed. The rain on his clothes dripped onto the polished hospital floor, each drop a small percussion against tile. "Marcus is stable," Brooke continued, moving closer with the fluid precision of apex predators. "You're safe. But I need you to sit down right now." Morrison's lips moved around words that wouldn't form. His pupils were pinpoint. Not drunk, something worse. His eyes rolled back, and his 6'5" frame began to collapse like a building losing structural integrity. Brooke covered the remaining distance in 3 strides, and her hands were there to catch his weight, to ease him down before his skull cracked against the hard hospital floor. But that wasn't the worst part. Private Chen's fingers wrapped around her wrist at 0157, a grip that sent every muscle in Brooke's body into instant alert. His pupils were blown wide, the kind of pupil dilation that meant his intracranial pressure was climbing, but his eyes, God, his eyes were remembering something. Something he'd buried under 18 months of blast-induced fog. "I know you," he whispered, his voice thin as tissue paper. "Sanjin. You carried me. 3 miles. Through the wire. Through everything." Brooke's hand stilled on the blood pressure cuff. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above them, indifferent to the moment crystallizing in the darkness. Chen's hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the neural pathways suddenly firing, synapses reconnecting like soldiers finding their way back to the unit after getting separated in the dark. "You're safe," she said quietly, the only truth she could offer him right now. She gently extracted her wrist from his grip and finished the vitals check with the mechanical precision of someone whose body had learned to operate independently of her mind. Blood pressure elevated. Heart rate climbing. Temperature stable. The numbers told her what she already knew. His brain was waking up, pressure building behind his eyes, fragments of memory surfacing like a body rising in dark water. She couldn't be here when the full picture returned. Couldn't be in the room when he said her name, her real name, when the tattoo on his arm suddenly made sense and the pieces aligned into something that would shatter the carefully constructed illusion of who Brooke Sullivan was supposed to be. She turned to leave, but Chen gripped the bedrail with his other hand, his voice rising. "Wait. What's your—" But she was already moving, already crossing to the medication cart, already becoming invisible again, just another night shift nurse in scrubs the color of bruises. The trauma bay doors exploded inward at 0200. Morrison was 6'5" of pure kinetic panic, his shoulders filling the doorway like he was too large for the architecture of a civilian hospital. His eyes were wild animal eyes, the pupils pinned, his jaw working soundlessly before sound came, a roar that wasn't quite human, not quite animal, something forged in a place where the line between the two had been erased by mortars and ambushes and the weight of a friend's body going limp in your arms. "Where is he?" Morrison's voice was a physical thing, a bass note that rattled the monitors and made the overhead lights flicker. "Chen. Private Marcus Chen. Where is my brother?" Every nurse at the station bolted. Movement happened in the way panic moves, not logical, not efficient, just pure mammalian flight. They scattered like startled birds, scattering toward supply closets and the back hallway and anywhere that wasn't ground zero. The resident froze mid-sentence, his pen dropping to the floor. The attending physician's face drained 3 shades paler. Brooke didn't move. She set down the medication cup she'd been preparing and walked directly toward Morrison, her hands visible and empty, held at shoulder height in the universal language of someone announcing they were not a threat. Her footsteps were steady, measured, each one deliberate enough to cut through the chaos and register as intentional rather than reactive. This was muscle memory too, a different kind, earned in a different kind of training. Morrison. His name. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered in a low cadence that seemed to reach beneath the panic and touch something older, something that responded to authority the way soldiers responded to authority. I'm the charge nurse. Your brother is here. He's stable. I need you to come with me, but you're going to breathe first. Can you do that? Morrison's eyes locked onto hers, and she saw it, the moment recognition flickered across his face like a match striking in darkness. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from adrenaline, from the weight of 24 hours of not knowing, from the sound of the casualty notification and the hours of driving with his foot pressed to the floor because driving was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. He called me, Morrison said, and his voice had dropped, the panic recalibrating into something more manageable. Said he remembered something. Something about Sanjin. Then nothing. The line just, dead. And I couldn't reach him and he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The ending was written across his face in capital letters, and I thought he was dead. Brooke moved closer, still slow, still telegraphing every motion. Her voice dropped another octave, moving into the frequency range that made people listen at a cellular level. He's alive. Heart rate elevated but regular. Vital stable as of 4 minutes ago. He's been asking for you, but his memory is fragmenting, some recall, some gaps. That's normal with his injury profile. It's called post-traumatic amnesia, and it resolves on its own timeline. Morrison's shoulders dropped maybe 6 inches, the catastrophic scenario recalibrating into something survivable. His breathing came easier. His hand stopped shaking quite so violently. Can I see him? There was the boy underneath the 250 pounds of muscle and rage. Just a soldier who wanted to verify that his brother-in-arms was still breathing. Come with me. Brooke turned toward bed 12, and Morrison followed, his presence like a gravitational field bending the air around them. Other staff members watched from the safety of the nursing station, their faces a study in confusion. One nurse whispered something that sounded like, "How did she?" but Brooke wasn't paying attention. Chen saw Morrison and his face crumpled, a full-grown army ranger suddenly looking like the 22-year-old private he'd been in Sanjin when the IED detonated and his world became noise and darkness and the sensation of being carried, always being carried, by someone whose voice was steady as a rifle shot telling him to hold on, just hold on. Morrison, Chen breathed, and the way he said it was like a prayer. Morrison crossed the distance and gripped Chen's shoulder, and Brooke saw the exact moment they both stopped trembling, not because the danger was past, but because they were anchored again, tethered to someone who understood the specific weight of surviving when others didn't. Brooke turned to move away, to return to the medication cart, to recede back into the background. But that was when Sterling emerged from his office, his shirt perfectly pressed despite the hour, his face already compressed into that expression of pedagogical superiority that meant he was about to demolish someone for the crime of doing their job better than he did. Step back, Sullivan. His voice was level, conversational, the way a man sounds when he's absolutely certain of his power. You're not authorized to conduct initial patient assessments. Resident, get over here. I'll handle this case. The resident, still pale, started toward the trauma bay. Morrison didn't look at Sterling. Just kept his hand on Chen's shoulder like an anchor. Brooke didn't respond to Sterling. Didn't acknowledge him. Her hands were already moving, checking Morrison's pupils, one blown, one reactive, and her voice had changed. Not louder. Lower. The frequency that made people listen because not listening had consequences. Subdural hematoma, she said, still addressing Morrison but speaking for the room. One blown pupil suggests increased intracranial pressure. He's herniating. I need a crash cart and neurosurgery called now. Sullivan, I said. Sterling's face was already reddening, the color of a man unused to being ignored. You will step away from that patient or I will have security remove you. Brooke's hands didn't stop moving. She was palpating Morrison's skull now, her fingers tracing the fracture line beneath the skin, finding the precise spot where the pressure needed to be relieved. She marked it with a pen in one economical motion, her touch as certain as a surgeon's. He has minutes, not hours. Her voice was absolutely flat, the emotion excised and replaced with something more useful. Authority. Pure authority. Someone get me a burr hole kit. Sterling grabbed her shoulder. His hand was warm and damp and furious. I said step back. This is your final warning. Brooke looked up at him, and her eyes were the color of steel cooling in deep water. Empty of fear. Empty of anything except the calculation of how many seconds she had before Morrison's brain stem herniated through his foramen magnum and he became a vegetable or a corpse, depending on which direction the pressure went. Then write me up, doctor. She turned back to the equipment. After I save his life. The neurosurgeon was 20 minutes out. Morrison's breathing was becoming agonal, the sound of someone's brain starting to shut down its own life support, the terrible rhythmic gasping that meant the end was approaching. Chen was screaming now, trying to pull out his own lines to get to his friend, and Morrison was trying to hold his hand and hold on and not panic, and all of it was converging into a moment that would tip one way or another. Brooke's hands moved like they'd rehearsed this 1,000 times, because she had. Her fingers found the angle, the depth, the precise point of entry for the needle. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. Morrison's breathing immediately shifted, the agonal gasping stopping, replaced with something almost normal, almost human, almost like the breath of a man who wasn't about to die on a trauma bay floor. The neurosurgeon arrived 8 minutes later to find the critical intervention already completed, the burr hole perfectly placed, Morrison's intracranial pressure stabilized, the patient moved to ICU and climbing back toward baseline. Sterling was on his phone before Morrison even cleared the trauma bay doors, his voice low and urgent, carrying the weight of a man who understood that he'd just watched his power get dismantled by a night shift nurse in scrubs. Morrison's eyes rolled back like a malfunctioning shutter, his 250-pound frame going slack as the head injury he'd been hiding finally announced itself. He collapsed toward the polished trauma bay floor with the dead weight of someone whose brain had just stopped negotiating with his body. Every staff member at Sacred Heart froze, the nurses, the residents, even the attending at the far station. This was the moment where panic set in. This was the moment where people ran. Brooke moved toward him instead. She caught Morrison's weight before it could crash down, her hands finding his torso with the precise geometry of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Not in a hospital. In places where the ground was sand instead of tile, where the light came from muzzle flashes, where every second of control meant the difference between a soldier going home or going into the ground. She controlled his descent with perfect body mechanics, lowering him to the polished floor without letting his head strike it. One arm cradled the back of his skull. The other guided his shoulder down. No impact. No worsening of the bleed. Just the soft whisper of scrubs against tile as she laid him flat. Suction, she said. Not a question. Not a request. The tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A resident moved without thinking. The suction apparatus appeared in her hands like a reflex. Brooke's fingers found the anatomical landmarks, the clavicle, the first rib, the space between them where the subclavian vein ran like a highway beneath the skin. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers. She'd done this before. Not on a trauma bay floor. In a Humvee rolling through Sanjin Valley with small arms fire coming through the windows and a ranger bleeding out against her chest. She knew exactly where to go. 14-gauge angiocath, she said. The words came out like she'd been giving orders in this hospital for a decade instead of pushing meds for a bully doctor who'd fabricated half her personnel file. Prep the burr hole site. I need a hand drill. Someone gasped. Someone moved. Someone else, a young nurse named Patterson, actually grabbed the equipment without being asked twice. The room had shifted. The hierarchy that had made Brooke invisible for 18 months had inverted in the time it took for one man to collapse. Her fingers marked the site with a precision that came from muscle memory etched into her bones. Sanjin Province, 2016. A 3-mile exfil with Private Chen screaming that his legs weren't there anymore, Morrison and 2 other rangers providing cover fire while Brooke kept the ranger's spinal column from moving. That was when Chen had asked for her name. That was when she'd told him, "Call me Reaper." And then she'd tattooed it on his arm with a needle and ink from a medical supply kit because he'd asked her to mark him so he'd never forget that death had reached for him and someone had reached back harder. She didn't have to explain any of this to Dr. Sterling, who was watching from across the trauma bay with his jaw working like a hinge that wouldn't stay closed. The burr hole decompression took for minutes. Her hands moved like they'd rehearsed this exact sequence 10,000 times. The small hand drill bit into bone with a sound like a dentist's office made of nightmares. Blood and cerebrospinal fluid released in a hiss, the pressure inside Morrison's skull dropping like an elevator cable had been cut. His oxygen saturation, which had been dropping toward dangerous territory, began to climb. 88, 91, 94. The neurosurgeon arrived 8 minutes later to find the critical intervention already completed, the burr hole perfectly placed, Morrison's intracranial pressure stabilized, the patient already bagged and moved toward the ICU, climbing back toward baseline like a plane that had been pulled up just before it hit the ground. Sterling was on his phone before Morrison even cleared the trauma bay doors. His voice was low and urgent, carrying the weight of a man who understood that he'd just watched his power get dismantled by a night shift nurse in scrubs. He moved toward a supply room, the small, windowless closet where the 4 tubing was kept, and the door closed on a conversation that would reshape the rest of the week. Within the hour, he'd called Joel Finch at the hospital board. Finch owed him 3 referrals and a consulting contract worth $400,000. Within 90 minutes, he'd called State Nursing Board investigator Raymond Cole, a man who'd been cultivated over 2 years through careful mentions at medical conferences and an introduction to Cole's daughter, who was now working in Sterling's practice. Within 2 hours, he'd called his lawyer, Sanford Pierce, a credential challenge specialist who'd successfully destroyed the licenses of 4 other nurses in the past 5 years. The trap was already built. Brooke had just activated it by saving a life. By 0700, the machinery was humming. A formal complaint had been filed, dated retroactively to 3 weeks prior. Witness statements, from nurses who'd never actually spoken to her, from residents who'd been in different parts of the hospital, had been fabricated with careful precision. Medication discrepancies that didn't exist were documented. Charting errors that had never occurred were flagged. 12 pages of predetermined narrative, all building toward a single, inevitable outcome. At 0730, Brooke was summoned to the 3rd floor. Karen Webb, the HR director, was a woman in her 50s who'd spent 2 decades watching power operate in hospitals. She'd seen doctors ruin nurses before. She'd seen the pattern. She knew exactly what was happening and she didn't have the power to stop it. The termination letter was already printed, the letterhead bearing Sacred Heart's official seal, her name on the authorization line next to Sterling's recommendation. Effective immediately, Webb said quietly, sliding the paper across the desk. Performing procedures outside scope of practice. Brooke read through the fabricated evidence with the same composure she'd displayed in the trauma bay. Her eyes moved across the forged witness statements. She noted the medication discrepancies that had been invented from whole cloth. She watched Sterling's carefully constructed paper trail do exactly what it had been designed to do. "I need to understand something," Brooke said. Not angry. Not defensive. Just curious, like someone asking about the weather. "Why?" Webb finally looked at her. Her eyes were the color of old money and genuine regret. "Because some people have power in this hospital, and some people just have principles. And principles don't pay legal fees." The words hit like a sucker punch delivered in slow motion. Brooke stood. The motion was smooth, controlled, a predator rising from a rest position. "I see." Security guard Davis, the same man who'd nodded to her every night for 2 years, who'd never made her feel like she didn't belong, met her at her locker. He wouldn't look at her as she pulled the cardboard box from the shelf. His face had the expression of someone following orders he hated. The box contained everything that mattered: a cracked mug printed with "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a dying succulent with brown-edged leaves that had been slowly dying in her locker for 3 months, and a photograph of her SEAL team leader whose face had been carefully burned away per protocol. The face of the man who'd signed the order that had erased her existence. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan did not exist anymore. Not officially. Not according to any military database. The government had erased her service records, buried the classified operation in Sanjin that had saved 43 coalition lives but had to be erased for diplomatic reasons because it had crossed into denied territory. She'd been ordered to disappear and she'd obeyed, trading a dress uniform for hospital scrubs, trading a team for night shifts, trading a life that mattered for a life that nobody could ever know about. The combat boots stayed in the locker. They wouldn't fit in the box anyway. They were the last piece of her that she couldn't carry out of this building. At 08 for 2, Brooke stood at the bus stop on Abercorn Street in the rain. The cardboard box was already going soft in her arms, the bottom beginning to tear from the moisture. The succulent was tipping sideways, its weight pulling the box toward failure. She caught it with hands that had once held a rifle, with hands that had sewn tattoos into the skin of a bleeding ranger, with hands that had performed a burr hole decompression on a trauma bay floor 40 minutes ago. Behind her, Sacred Heart rose against the grey morning sky, its windows reflecting rain that fell like applause for a performance nobody would ever understand. The box tore a little more. The succulent nearly fell. Brooke shifted her grip and kept walking. She had 3 days before the real conversation would begin. By 7 in the morning, the fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's HR office hummed their institutional song, and Karen Webb wouldn't meet Brooke's eyes. The director sat behind a desk too large for her authority, her hands folded on a termination letter that had been signed before Brooke ever walked through the door. Performing procedures outside scope of practice, Webb read aloud, her voice carrying the hollow certainty of someone reciting lines she'd been given. The paper trembled slightly in her grip. "We have no choice, Brooke. The documentation is clear." Brooke stood motionless, her composure the kind that comes from having already survived the worst. "The burr hole decompression I performed saved a life. You know that." Webb's jaw tightened. She looked toward the window, toward the Abercorn Street intersection visible in the distance. "I'm aware of what happened. But Dr. Sterling has filed formal complaints, and the State Nursing Board has initiated a review. The hospital board believes it's in everyone's best interest if we—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Everyone in this building knew the truth. Sterling's network of connections to the hospital president had been activated like a trap snapping shut. The board member who owed him referrals. The state investigator he'd cultivated. The lawyer who specialized in credential challenges. All of it orchestrated with surgical precision to ensure one outcome. "You know this is retaliation," Brooke said quietly. "Not a question." Webb's hands unclenched. She picked up the termination letter and slid it across the desk with the careful distance of someone handling something radioactive. "Your final paycheck will be processed by end of business. Security will escort you to collect your belongings from your locker." Brooke didn't take the letter. She simply turned and walked out, her gait steady, her expression unchanged. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel of fluorescent white. She could hear the unit clerk typing, a monitor beeping in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a hospital that would forget her name before lunch. She had entered these corridors as a healer carrying classified wounds no one could see. She was leaving as just a nurse, just a woman, just another casualty in a war nobody knew she'd already fought. The bus stop on Abercorn Street was 6 blocks away, and the rain started before she reached it. Warm September rain that soaked through her scrubs and made the cardboard box in her arms go soft and heavy. Inside the box, her locker had yielded almost nothing. A cracked mug printed with "World's Okayest Nurse" that someone had given her 3 years ago at a secret Santa nobody had wanted to attend. A dying succulent with brown edges, something she'd adopted because it looked like it needed saving. And the photograph, the unit photo from her last rotation with the SEAL team, everyone in dress uniform standing in front of the Pentagon flagpole, everyone's faces except hers carefully burned away per protocol, erased because the operation never officially happened, because she had never officially existed there, because the government had already begun the process of removing her from history. She stood under the shelter of the bus stop's metal frame, watching rain bead on the cardboard, watching her hands grip the edges of something falling apart. The phrase they used in the briefings came back to her: compartmentalized. Her military service compartmentalized. Her records compartmentalized. Her heroism compartmentalized in a sealed file in a Pentagon basement that would stay sealed for 40 years or more. Sanjin was officially erased. The 72-hour operation that had resulted in 43 coalition lives preserved and 0 American casualties existed nowhere. She existed nowhere. She was just Brooke now, just a nurse with a box of useless things, standing in the rain on a street in Savannah where nobody would ever know she'd held a combat veteran's life in her hands at 0200 hours and 1. The bus came. She got on. She didn't look back. 3 days passed like water through a strainer. Brooke moved through them without particular shape or direction, staying in a motel on the edge of the city, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and kept the door lock simple. She ate when her body reminded her to eat. She slept when exhaustion won the argument with her mind. On the evening of the 3rd day, she did something she hadn't planned to do. She borrowed the motel owner's truck and drove back to Sacred Heart, not to fight, not to confront anything, just to collect her final paycheck from the HR window. A small thing. Administrative closure. The kind of small thing that meant nothing until it meant everything. The hospital at 1830 was in the soft transition between day shift and night shift. The hallways held that particular quiet that comes before the evening chaos. She moved through them with the invisibility of someone already departed, already a ghost, already erased. The HR window was near the main entrance. She could see it from the corridor. She could see Karen Webb's successor, a younger woman, preparing to close up for the day. That's when she heard it. A single word that stopped time cold. Reaper. The voice came from the trauma bay, from Private Chen's unit, cutting through the ambient hospital noise like a surgical blade through tissue. Brooke turned. Through the open door of the unit, she could see him sitting up in bed 12, the Army Ranger whose arms bore her call sign tattooed in letters so precise and permanent they looked like they'd been carved into the bone itself. His eyes were clear. His memory had come back. His hands were trembling slightly as he gripped the bedside rail, but his voice was steady and certain, and he had just spoken her name aloud in a room full of nurses and orderlies and students, and the entire unit went still. Every conversation stopped. Every monitor seemed to turn up its volume. The fluorescent lights hummed louder. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And in that silence, the kind of silence that only comes when the world is about to crack open, Brooke understood that the firing, the humiliation, the cardboard box in the rain, all of it was about to transform into something else entirely. Hit that like button now. And I need to know, would you have revealed your identity, or stayed invisible? Drop your answer below. Subscribe so you never miss a story.